Um, Lesson 51, variation, selection, and competition. We will discuss how variation, selection, and competition affect natural selection. Now, natural selection is what we discussed last lesson, and this is going to be like a little bit of more of a summary. What I want to get by the end of this lesson is the ability to write down what natural selection is in like a written sort of way. Whereas last lesson, what we were sort of looking at is, well, what is natural selection in a general idea? Okay, so let's go backwards a bit to talk about what we looked at last lesson. Last lesson, what we looked at was we looked at this, and I sort of said, we just looked at a bit of an example. First, we looked at artificial selection, and that's where humans choose who gets to survive. In natural selection, we looked at, well, how does nature choose? In this case, we had a desert, we had two lizards. We had these lizards get picked off and eaten and have children. The bigger lizards were able to have more children, more likely to survive. Whereas, these green lizards, because they showed up easily, they were good prey. What we saw is that, after a while, after a couple of generations, there were still a couple of random mutations, but after a couple of generations, we noticed that, these orange lizards seem to be the most favored species, and they decided to be the species that would take over. They were large enough that they could breed multiple copies of themselves, and so therefore spread out. And because they were orange, they were harder to see. Whereas these darker colored ones or these lighter colored ones could be caught by birds or prey and stuff. So they had essentially mutated. This mutation that made them orange essentially had served them as an adaptation. They had started to adapt to the environment. And so the question then becomes, well, how can we talk about these? What kind of words do we need to know to be able to best describe natural selection? We said natural selection is when nature selects certain individuals to survive and pass on their genes and thus change the species over time. That was one of the other things as well. If you looked at this is generation 8 to generation 9. We're up to generation 9 before we've got like the whole species evolving from 2 green lizards to like 4 or 5 orange lizards. So that is a change over multiple generations, not just one generation. And it's a change for the whole population. It's not just one individual becomes more orange, all the individuals become more orange. We sometimes know this as survival of the fittest. When we say survival of the fittest, as I said to you guys last time, that doesn't mean the most muscly animal or the most muscly plant survives. It means the plant that can fit into the environment the best is the one that survives. And the best way to understand natural selection is through these ideas: variation, selection, and competition. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. Variation, selection, and competition. We're going to discuss how these things sort of come together. Now, we've already talked about variation, so that shouldn't be necessarily too brand new for you guys. And selection and competition are all are very similar as well. I should point out, ladies and gents, that these words are very similar to one another. So I've got a slide towards the end that kind of tries to put all these ideas together into one idea, but also in that one idea, I want to try and make you guys aware that although these things are similar, they are different, and this is how they're different and what they mean. Let's do variation first. Variation. At some point, there will be too many individuals in an environment. Oopsies. Whoa. At some point, there'll be too many individuals in an environment. There won't be enough food or space or what's getting eaten. And that is not a good thing. E.g., in this plant, e.g. for plants, there's not enough sunlight. You look at all these plants, right? There are so many different plants and trees to the point where the ground is actually not that bright. It's actually dark. So a better lot, not much sun is probably going to be getting to those plants at the bottom. There are just too many plants in that population. And what you would say is the environment can't sustain that amount of plants. There's not enough light, there's not enough space. Now, of course, for an animal species, if you think about, like, I don't know, take a reef that has a bunch of take a reef that has a bunch of, I don't know, tuna in it or something, and those tuna fish just, they love, they eat everything, but there's just not enough food for them to eat. That's another thing that you could think about. Essentially, you get to a point where there is just so many animals or so many plants in the system that the environment just can't support it. It can't have that many. It can't have that many of that type of animal in there, because ultimately you end up with this problem like this. So what does variation do for us? What does variation mean for a situation like this, where you have like so many of the same type of plant? If you have so many of the same type of plant or so many of the same type of fish in one environment, what does it mean to have variation? I'm going to change the slide in about 30 seconds. Okay, so what does it mean to have, what does it mean to have variation? Well, variation is essentially, in genetically diverse populations, there'll be many variations of each organism. So that's sort of like saying, yeah, sure, if you have a big enough population, which is genetically diverse, you are going to have lots of individuals with different variations. You may have some orange lizards and some green lizards and some purple lizards and some whatever lizards. And some individuals will have an advantage. In this case, we know from the last example, the orange lizard has an advantage. The reason the orange lizard has an advantage is because it blends in. Individuals with an advantage, because of their variation, so if you want you to think of this, they've got a variation, it's a natural variation. Because of their variation, individuals with an advantage will survive and make more offspring and add to their good genes. I've used brackets good because, like, genes aren't necessarily good or bad, but yeah, to the gene pool, other individuals may get wiped out. So yeah, you can see that on my picture to the right here, our green lizard here is going to get eaten because, yeah, sure, this green lizard's got a variation, but that variation doesn't benefit this green lizard, so he's going to get eaten. The orange lizard also has a variation, but the orange lizard's variation means that it blends in, so it's more likely to survive and have children. That's one of the things that drives natural selection. This is one of the first ones that we sort of discussed. Mostly, we discussed this a lot. So if you had a population and that it could only ever reproduce exactly the same identical copies, there wouldn't be evolution. You need to have variation. You need to have some changes happening. You need to roll the dice and have some mutations. Without mutations, Without any variation, you would not get evolution, you'd not get natural selection. And that'd be really bad. Some organisms mutate a lot in that their children are very, very different to them. An example of those are like frogs. If you look at frogs, your frogs mutate a lot. There are a lot of mutations in frogs. And that's actually really good for frogs because frogs need to be able to change. Their population needs to be able to change because the environment that frogs live in change all the time. Whereas if you take something like a bear or something, is like the variation in mutations in bears are going to be very, very small because and not happen very often because bears, like, I'm thinking about a bear, it only has one child, one cub, maybe two cubs. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to have huge variations because then you've only got such a small population as it is. So it's sort of another way to look at it. But yeah, honestly, variation is necessary in order for things to evolve. If you just had one thing making another thing, making like the exact same thing, then you wouldn't have evolution. And what would be worse is if suddenly something happened and then there wasn't another copy of it, well then that'd be bad. Evolution needs to have some kind of variation. So you could go to make something different. And then if one particular strain of that species dies out, that doesn't mean that the whole species dies out. That's why variation is so important. Variation is all about rolling the dice every so often. Maybe you get a 6. Maybe you'll start to benefit and actually grow. Maybe you won't get a 6. Maybe you'll get a 1 and you'll die out. But yeah, that's what variation means. I'm going to change the slide now. Oh, actually, before I do, I want to talk about why I put this in good. Obviously, in this case, it's really good to be orange in the desert because, as I keep saying to you guys, it's good to be orange in the desert because you blend into the ground color and the green one dies out. But as I keep saying, if all of a sudden there was a bunch of water in the desert and then for some reason there was a lot of the grass started to grow in this baked out riverbed, then all of a sudden it would actually be an advantage to be the green lizard and not the orange lizard. So that's a different way to look at variation as well. Variation, there's no such thing as a good gene or a bad gene. There's just different genes for different situations. If you had an animal that had a really, really furry coat, you put them in the desert, yeah, sure, that's not going to survive. It's going to dry. It's going to overheat and die. But then if all of a sudden there is a massive snow, like glacier incident, and that area of the country became very, very cold, then that would be an advantage. So it can, like, genes can be good or bad, don't necessarily have to be good or bad. It just depends on the environment that they're in. So that's variation. That's our first of our 3 ideas. Does that make sense? Am I going too quickly? If I'm going too quickly, please let me know because I can't really see. But otherwise, I'm going to change the slide. Considering I haven't had like 20 people yell at me and say, sir, you're going too quick, I'm going to change the slide. Remember, you can message me privately if you don't want everyone to know that you're a bit slow at writing the stuff down. It's fine. Let's grab a look at the next idea here. So the next idea is selection. So remember, we've got variation, we've got selection. The selection part of natural selection is caused by biotic, which is living, and abiotic, non-living factors. These are the factors that control selection. It can sometimes be referred to as selective pressure. The best way that, and now what I want to do is I want to link this idea to the previous idea that we just did. Selection determines which variations survive. And I thought that was a really good point to put in here. So let me just, I know that you guys are probably going to copy midway through copying this down. I want to quickly go back a second. I know that's annoying, but still. Look at this. So we said the orange lizard survives because it blends in. The reason that it blends in, it's good to blend in, is because otherwise it's going to get eaten by this bird. So that idea of the predator eating the more visible, lizard is a selection pressure. You want to avoid being eaten, so that's why that pressure pushes you to be more likely to be orange. That's what's happening here. Selection is these factors, the selection causes certain variations to survive. And then I said, oh, well, you know, if the land was green and there was lots of grass, the bird would start eating the orange one. Suddenly the selection would be different. The best way to survive, what the nature would start selecting is more green colored lizards, if nature was a person. So selection determines which of these variations, which of these rolls of the dice, which one's a winning roll of the dice. Now, in the background, I've got a picture of a polar bear, and of course that polar bear is sitting in one of the coldest environments. Now, ice and the temperature is going to be a abiotic factor. It's going to be something that's going to, it's something natural that's going to change. It's something that is non-living that affects which animals survive, which animals die. Obviously, animals that are better suited towards a cold climate are going to survive. Like a polar bear has got a large amount of body mass, body heat, and thick fur, as well as a thick layer of fat around its outer edge to keep it warm, to keep it insulated, and that means it's going to survive. If you were to throw a lizard out into the Arctic, they would die very quickly because it can't maintain a warm body temperature. Now, biotic, is there any biotic pressures on this bear? Well, yes, there are. You notice the bear is white. The bear is white, so it can blend into the ground. And you might say, oh, so it doesn't get eaten by birds. No. The bear is the hunter here. It's actually beneficial for the bear to be white because it can blend in, so that when it's trying to hunt down seals, it can actually capture them really easily because the seals won't see them coming before they get there. So that's just a different way to think about so these are some of the different things that are causing the animal to be the way it is, to choose to select different things. I'm going to keep this slide up for another 30 seconds. Unless you need a little bit longer, in which case let me know. Okay, this next part, ladies and gents, is the part where I'd like to get you guys involved in the lesson. So what I would like you to do is I would like you guys to help me, and I'm going to open up chat now, because I'd like you guys to put in chat some ideas that we can write down. I'm actually going to sit on this slide for biotic, living things that may cause some, selective pressures, oopsies, and some non-living things. So I've got an example already here for you. Temperature. That's going to cause some animals to live and some animals to die because the temperature is going to be, and that's a non-living thing. Competition. So if you have to compete with other animals to get food, then that's going to mean that some animals survive and some animals die. The difference between competition and temperature is your competition, your other animals or your other plants, they're going to be living things, whereas temperature is not a living thing. Right, I will move on from this slide once I've got, let's say, 10 student answers. So I want 10 answers for here. Amount of food straight off the bat without even competition yet. So that's straight off the bat. The amount of food, that's going to be from Lena. Altitude from Brendan and Leah, love that. So altitude is going to be probably over here for it's a non-living thing. Altitude is great, which means, you know, obviously some animals are going to be able to live up at a very, very high height. Some animals won't be able to live at a high height. So if you're up in the mountains, that's going to be a pressure. Availability of food is definitely one of these ones here. Animals that are good at hunting food, they're going to be the ones that survive. All the ones that, you know, the ones that don't need as much food, they're going to be the ones that survive as well. Okay, let's see if we can get a couple more, ladies and gents. Let's think outside the box. What are some things that might cause? We also, by the way, the lizard one is not on here. So if you want to think of a way that is the lizard one a biotic factor, an abiotic? What does it mean? Think of a couple more for me, ladies and gents. Thank you for those answers I've got so far. Climate is one, but I've already got temperature. So yeah, I'm going to add that to the end. Camouflage, yeah, but camouflage is good, but what does camouflage protect you from? Why do we want to have camouflage, Brendan? Predators, thank you. So predators are a abiotic factor. That is something that you want to, that's going to cause you to change. You may get camouflage, you may get better at, you may get smaller, you may get able to dig holes. That might be all things that you may change about your body to adapt to try to protect yourself from predators. Sunlight is an abiotic factor. Good job there. Sunlight is going to be, the availability of sunlight is going to cause plants to grow really, really tall, and sunlight may cause different animals to come out and stuff like that, interact, and the amount of sunlight. Moonlight, not so much, Brendan. Good suggestion there. But I guess technically, I guess it would be beneficial for hunting if you were able to. Yeah, maybe. I'm going to say maybe. Water is definitely one. Good job, Olivia. Water is a abiotic factor. Availability of water to drink, availability of water to environment is a little bit too broad. Good answer, but a little bit too broad. Think more specific. Water is important because, yeah, we could also think about water as well if you think about animals as well that live in the water. If you think about like fish and stuff, they need to have you could talk about, and I might actually branch off from water, talk about fresh water versus salt water. So if you're living in fresh water, you may need to figure out, can you survive in fresh water? Do you need to change your body systems? Min has given one trees, and I like trees as a bit of a thing. So I might go trees, but I also might just say shelter. So expanding of that idea. Minerals. Let me think of minerals. Sort of, not really. Mates, yeah, definitely. Getting a sexual mate is definitely one that is going to be something important. I'm going to throw one in here just to maybe start to get you guys to think outside the box here. Disease. Disease is one that's going to shape but is a biological living thing, but it's all affects living things. And so, uh, Brent, did you just say disease while I was writing down? Yeah, diseases and viruses are ones that do affect your living. They are living things that will affect your things. So one way you can think about this is, what is the change to one of these things? What's a change to a living thing could I just thought before you wrote it. It's really annoying. Who can tell me? Yes, all right. Technically, yes, mean viruses would be non-living, but I guess when you're talking about like these kinds of things, you're more talking about, well, a virus only really exists in living things. So when we're talking about biotic factors, a virus would be a biotic factor. But that's getting really technical. But you are correct. But it's yeah. Who can think of maybe a massive change to the environment that could end up with a lot of unfortunate disasters. What kind of disaster? Can you give me specific disasters I can write down? Yeah, what kind of natural flood, love it. Let's go flood. A flood is definitely going to change it's definitely going to be an abiotic thing. It's not, you can't control over it. If you can't prepare for floods, then you won't necessarily be able to do it. Tsunami as well, tornado, yep, all of these are definitely other disasters that and like it's going to be difficult. Flooding is one of the best ones that I kind of like. Another one that I'm going to add on there with flood is I'm going to add fire. Now the reason I'm going to add flood and fire is because tsunamis and earthquakes are these are ones that are animals can't really predict and stuff. Whereas a flood, if a fire, right? If you're an animal and you're like, oh, I'm curious about this fire, and you go up and you touch the fire and you get burnt, then that's going to be really, really bad for you, and you're going to die. So therefore, that's going to mean that animal dies off. And so curiosity about fire will not be a gene that gets passed on to other generations. Now, human destruction, pollution, stuff like that. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to put that on there. Pollution would come under human destruction as well. So I'm going to talk about. Yeah, let's going to go with human intervention. Now, before you guys say, isn't humans like invasive species? Whoa, good answer. I like that. That's 10, by the way, but ladies and gentlemen, human intervention, we're talking about like when humans come in and like they cut down a bunch of trees and stuff like that. That's going to be that. Invasive species is a really good answer. That's going to force animals to change. But yeah, all of these things are definitely going to be things that that affect whether or not a certain species survives or dies. Availability of food, shelter, all these ones, predators, how do you protect yourself from predators? If you're a plant, how do you get a sufficient amount of sunlight and water? Water, you could also ask the question, is it going to be fresh water? All of these random little things are going to cause some species to survive and some species to not survive. And that's just the way things go. The availability of food is also an interesting one, or the amount of food is also an interesting one. So it's like you can change there are lots of ways around these problems as well. Evolution might mean that your food source is no longer there. So maybe you need less food source. Maybe you evolve a way to eat a different kind of food source. That's a sort of way to deal with these things. If if a disease goes through a population, maybe you evolve a way to deal with that disease. Fire. How quickly does a tree grow back after fire? Maybe that's an evolutionary trait that would be an advantage. It sort of is going to cause some species to survive and other species to not. These are all different types of selection pressures, and there are many, 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 many more of them. What we're going to be doing is, as we go through this topic, is we're going to be seeing like, oh, we're going to be seeing ones like, oh, well, you know, these coconuts are too hard for these animals to get into. How can these evolve? What kind of, that's a selection pressure. How can these people get an advantage over this particular thing? But you guys did really well coming up with them. So we've got a couple more slides left, and then I'm going to be done. So let's talk about the last of our 3 ideas, which is competition. Now, competition, all organisms fight, and we just talked about this actually, all organisms fight for food, and those with an advantage are less likely to survive and more likely to pass on their genes. So shelter and territory are other aspects animals fight for. On the right here, we've got a picture of 2 kangaroos, and they're actually probably fighting for breeding rights or mates, you know, the strongest kangaroo. They might be fighting over territories, like, well, this is my territory, get out, I'm going to, you know, attack you until you get out. But again, remember, this comes from the fact that we know if there's way too many animals in a particular area, or way too many plants in a particular area for the environment to sustain it, there is going to be competition. Because ultimately, only some animals will survive. And if only some animals are going to survive, then it's in your best interest to try and compete to make sure that you survive. The other competition may be to avoid becoming prey. Again, like if you think about our lizards, they're competing. You might not think that they're competing, but they are competing to survive. They're trying to make sure they don't become prey. And some of those animals have an advantage over other animals to avoid becoming prey. That green lizard might actually be fine if that green lizard could walk or run really, really quickly. So that becomes another way that evolution can adapt, lead to a species adapting. You might end up with faster and faster and faster lizards because they don't want to become eaten by birds. Another one that I always remember talking about with my year, who am I talking to? With my year 7 students, is if you ever look at predators versus prey. Now, prey normally have eyes on the side of their head. And that's so that they can see in all directions, so that they can avoid getting eaten. Predators, on the other hand, predators have eyes in the front of their head. And the reason that a predator has eyes in the front of their head is so that they can, like, you know, hunt. So they can hunt they can use it for depth perception so that they can hunt better. It's actually the best war thing. Oh, wait, no, wait. Yeah. So they can hunt better. And so that's why they might have an advantage, is that they want it. And so therefore, the position of their eyes becomes actually an evolutionary thing, a natural selection kind of pressure. And these fish, they're competing with other fish. They're competing with, you know, other fish to survive. And the fish that is the fish that is least likely to get eaten is the winner. That's the winner of the competition. And that fish, the prize that fish wins is they get to have children, and then those children are more likely to have those traits. With regards to breeding rights and mates, there is, like, of course, in a lot of sort of these cultures, the strongest animal is the one that survives, is the one that becomes the alpha sort of dominant male in the thing, and they're the ones that do most of the breeding, and so therefore, because they're the strongest, their genes get passed on, more likely to get passed on. It also means that yeah, but there are other things as well that sometimes nature selects for. If you look at the classic one that I can think of is peacocks. Peacocks are like beautiful colors, but the reason they're beautiful colors is because the female selects the peacock with the brightest colors. So there is an evolutionary pressure for peacocks to be brightly colored so that, you know, they get picked so that they can be mated. And of course, the brightest colors are the ones that genes get passed on. So therefore, whereas the dull, boring colors don't get passed on. So yeah. The last, shelter and territory, yeah, it makes sense. It's like if you're fighting for your first shelter and you're able to climb a tree, then you're going to outcompete animals that can't climb trees and stuff like that. So yeah, competition's a big one. I'm going to change the slide in about 20 seconds from now. We've only got about 2 or 3 more slides left. These are the main ones. Coming close to 10 o'clock. I want to try and get this done, hopefully, before 10 past 10, but we'll see how we go. Sorry, I know I was talking a lot today, but I want to get through these 3 big ideas. Someone said in chat, please hold on. All good. Wow, okay. Yeah, I'm going to assume this is all good. Okay, so let's bring all these ideas together. And I tried to bring, because when I was writing these slides, I was actually being like, I don't know the difference between, I was getting confused myself between the difference between competition, selection, and variation. I'm like, isn't competition and selection the same? I was like, well, you're competing with other fish to not get selected. I was like, wait, what? Isn't that a selection pressure? Isn't competition a selection? And eventually I got to this idea. I was like, oh, I don't really know. So I tried to combine all the ideas in one. And when I did that, I was like, oh, for some reason it all clicked in my own head. So I'm hoping the same thing happens for you guys. But this is all the ideas together in one. Organisms compete with each other to survive. Okay, there's competition. This competition helps choose which variation is best at surviving the selective pressure. And so these are all the 3 ideas together. So the idea is like, if you take out one of these things, you won't get any evolution. Think about this. If you took out variation, and that's what I said at the start, if every single organism that was copied was exactly the same, you wouldn't get any evolution, because ultimately one virus might come along and wipe out your full population. You need to have variation. You need to have every so often, you know, even though you need to have every so often, you make a different version of the thing that you're making. And, you know, because, you know, you need to make sure that you have variation, you have mutations every so often. Competition is going to be when selective pressure is how you choose which of these particular variations is worthy of surviving. Maybe you might say, you know, this particular species is worth surviving, this particular species is worth surviving, but this one is not. This one just doesn't fit into the environment. Maybe it's because the environment is extra cold. Maybe it's because the environment is extra windy. Maybe it's because the environment is extra dry. There isn't much water, and this triangle one needs a lot of water. So these are what survive. So without having selective pressure, you would just get variations upon variations upon variations. You just have so many different variations that you wouldn't actually choose one of them to win. And the last one is competition. The reason why these ones win is because this one can't compete very well. And because it can't compete, it dies. And so these other two, or it might not die, but it may not necessarily make as many children. So therefore, these two win the competition within this species, and so they pass on their genes. You need to have all three of these ideas together. I like this sort of down the bottom here. I found this picture because I typed in competition and I looked up some pictures, and I found this picture here. Just was a free picture, but I thought, you know what? I'm going to use this picture. Variation is the type of car. Now, let's just say you and your brother or you and your sister are racing cars. You know, variation says, oh, I'm going to choose car 6 or I'm going to choose car 8. There are so many different varieties of car here. The selection is the type of track. Okay, now this particular type of track may have a finish line that goes through a very, very, very small hole. And because it goes through a small hole, only like 7 is going to win, 6 can fit through the hole, 2 can fit through the hole, and 1 can fit through the hole, but the rest of them are too big, so they won't fit through the hole. And because they don't fit through the hole, because they don't fit through this small gap to get to the finish line, the competition is the other cars. Because these other cars don't fit, they won't win. And because they won't win, they lose the competition. And in the animal world, those cars wouldn't be allowed to compete again. They would die out. Whereas the small cars, they could then compete again and again and again, and so on and so forth. Only one can win. And in nature, it's very similar. If you don't reproduce, then your genes aren't going to get passed on. And therefore, then that means that your evolutionary line ends. Why don't you pass on your genes? Maybe because maybe because you don't pass on your genes. Well, why does that happen? Well, because you're just not very smart, or maybe just You might even look at this. I'm sort of rambling a little bit. I'm going to give you guys a second to copy this down. Now, human beings, one of the things we've evolved is intelligence. Intelligence is actually definitely our best trait, is our best hereditary trait. The fact that when you have children, that they are able to learn very quickly about the environment, and also we've learnt to manipulate the environment to our advantage. We're not the only animal that knows how to manipulate the environment to their advantage, but we definitely dominate when it comes to that. And because of that, their competition's a bit different. Of course, we can't really compare these variations, competitions and stuff to humans, but because ultimately it's a little bit different when competition. We just can't really compare it to modern day humans. You can, but it's got some weird complications to it. But I think this is a pretty good I like this sort of idea of the car racing. All the cars are different, that's a variation. Only the selection is a type of track. So obviously, where are they competing? On what sort of battlegrounds are they competing? And then, which car? Only one car can win because they're in a competition, and that car that wins is the car that's going to be the victory. And then you may want to go out and buy more cars like it. You could change this competition. You could make it, instead of a race, you could make it like whichever car gets knocked out of a circle first. And so therefore the big cars might be preferred to the small cars. But I'm going to change the slide now because I'm pretty happy with that. These are the 3 ideas: competition, variation, selective pressure, and this is how they come together. I hope it's pretty clear. let's just, one last thing before I move on to sort of not a new topic, but a little bit different. Let's just go back to here. So if I look at generation 8, right? The competition is going to be with these things. This is the competition. They want to survive. They're competing to survive. Okay, the winner gets to, the winner is the one that gets to go on and make new children. The selective pressure, what's causing certain things to evolve? The selective pressure is, or the selection is the predators. The predators are going to come in and they're hunting these animals, and that's what causes certain variations to win. What variations are we looking for? The variation is color, of course. So only certain colors are able to beat this selective pressure and be the best competitor to survive. So this is just, again, me trying to really show you that these 3 ideas I already talked about at the start. And so if you guys haven't written that 100 words of what happened about Liz's story, you guys can now use these words: variation, selective pressure, and competition to better describe it. You can say, well, there are mutations with every generation, which leads to a variety of different colors. The selective pressure is the predators that eat different lizards, but they're only going to eat lizards that are easy to spot. So therefore, that's going to be selective pressure. And the competition is to survive. You know, each of these are going to compete to try to survive. Now, if we go, you could also talk about competing to make children. You could say, well, the bigger ones compete because they're more likely to have more children than the small ones. So that's a different competition. But we're not going to talk about that too much. I'm going to finish up today's lesson by talking about all right, you know what? No, stuff it. I'll be nice to you. I won't get you to copy this down. I'll just read this to you so you can. But I do want to show you guys the effects of this. Before the 20th century, someone says, sir, someone said, okay, whatever. Before the 20th century, many people died from infection. Even a minor cut could turn lethal. This is actually true. Back in the Old West, if you got shot, you would be like, oh my God, I got shot. And you'd be like, oh my God, that's such a, people die all the time from getting shot. You think they must be deadly bullets. The bullets weren't really that deadly. The bad thing about getting shot was it was such a big wound that it would then get infected. And then once you get infected, you can get like blood poisoning, I think it is, and then you would die. So infection was really bad. We sometimes forget how good we have it now that we have antiseptics to kill infection and stuff like that. But then also, people found that there was some curative properties of mold. People used to, there were some people that would put special like mold powder, like ground up mold on cuts and stuff, and would actually stop those cuts from getting infected. What happened is in 1928, Alexander Fleming essentially isolated penicillin. Now, penicillin was the first antibiotic, and antibiotics are huge. These are things that could kill bacteria. This kind of changed the way that this is 1928, so this is after the First World War. So it actually changed a fair bit when we looked at the Second World War, because now, like, injured people didn't necessarily have to die because they could take these antibiotics and they could actually live. If you got stabbed or, got hit with shrapnel, then you could pick it out and you could actually have those things heal without you necessarily have those things heal without them getting infected and turning gangrene. I think gangrene was the word. Gangrenous? Yeah, I think that's probably what it turned into. So it's definitely changed the world a lot. It meant that people were dying of just little cuts and stuff like that. But okay, so there is something interesting with bacteria. You see, and this is something that I do want you to copy down. Is the next slide. Bacteria. Now, evolution of bacteria. Bacteria reproduce asexually, which means they make clones of themselves. So when you reproduce asexually, you make exact copies of yourself. Okay. Unlike sexual reproduction, in this case, your children are very, very different to you. Bacteria reproduce asexually. It means they're exactly their clones. They just split their DNA. It's just like mitosis, but it's mitosis except at the end, you get a brand new organism, not just a brand new cell. So, and that's probably mitosis and, asexual reproduction are very closely related. That's how, pretty much, I think that's how large organisms learned how to do that. Now, if you then take, like, every so often they make a mutation during the cloning process. So you may get a mutation which makes it have a thicker wall, or you may make it which is a different chemical structure in their cell wall, so on and so forth. But essentially the idea is that's how they were able to get variation in their species. They don't get variation via sexual reproduction like we do like animals do, like a lot of animals do. They get variation with their just mistakes got to do with their cloning process. So now let's just say antibiotics come along. Now let's just say this person's got a cut on their leg, and so they go in and so they get some antibiotics to kill all the bacteria that could be in their leg. Because these are really bad. By the way, dog bites really bad because dog bites have a lot of bacteria in them, so you can actually get infected really badly. So you have to go onto antibiotics. Antibiotics kill bacteria. So let's just say this antibiotic comes in and kills the bacteria. But so let's kill all the bacteria. And so we're done with the antibiotic, and what happens is you kill all the bacteria. But some may be resistant. And they may have mutated to be resistant to that antibiotic. So even though all the other bacteria we looked at died, one of them lives. Now, that living bacteria, right, this thing gets passed on to new generations. So what happens is that thing is passed on to make new generations of bacteria. What's worse is that these bacteria are now resistant to antibiotics. That essentially makes antibiotics less useful. Penicillin used to be the antibiotic of antibiotics. It was the best thing in the world. Now penicillin is not given as often as an antibiotic because it just doesn't work very much, because bacteria have evolved a way to avoid this. Now, one of the ones that, while you guys are copying this down, I'm going to tell you a quick story about something else, because I would like you to copy this down. You might want to draw a little picture as well. I don't know if you can, but yeah. The story that I like to tell you people about this one is this. If you ever look at a bottle of antibiotics, next time if you have a ear infection, or you have like a throat infection, whatever you get, or a UTI, if you get some kind of infection, they prescribe you with antibiotics. It always says in the bottle, make sure that you finish this bottle of antibiotics. And I think, okay, why? So what happens when you take this bottle of antibiotics? Every time you take an antibiotic, it kills all the bacteria. And then after, let's just say about maybe a week, it's a 10-day treatment. After 7 days, all the bacteria are mostly gone, and you can actually look through your body, and it's pretty much fine. You pretty much have no bacteria. And so what happens is after 7 days, people look and they think, well, why am I still taking this antibiotic if I'm cured now? I'm not sick anymore. So they don't finish the bottle of antibiotics. But every bottle of antibiotics, it says, please ensure you finish all of the tablets. The reason because of that is that if you don't, like, if you have, like, let's just say you have a week's worth of antibiotics, you killed off like 99% of the bacteria. Yeah, great, cool. But there's still 1% of that bacteria. And that 1% of bacteria that's left behind is going to be the strongest of all of the bacteria because it survived 7 days of antibiotics. And so if you then don't take your antibiotics, you're essentially saying, well, this 1% of like really strong, these 1% of really strong bacteria, they're allowed to survive and they're allowed to reproduce. Now, if you have taken the full week of antibiotics, you may be more likely to have killed all of the bacteria. So even the strongest bacteria, it dies as well because it can only be hit with antibiotics so much. But essentially, if you don't finish it and you let them live, then that's what happens. So if you're ever using a bottle of antibiotics and it says to finish the bottle, you should finish the bottle. Make sure you wipe out all the bacteria. You also don't want to run the risk of, yeah, sure, you may have killed 99% of it by having it for a week. But if you then don't have it and then all of a sudden it grows back into your body, and then next thing you know, you go, well, I have to take this antibiotics for 3 weeks now to kill it because now the antibiotics are stronger against the bacteria is stronger against that antibiotic. Or you might need to go into a different antibiotic. We are always looking for new antibiotics to beat some of these new bacteria. Some of them are known as superbugs. There are some really dangerous strands of bacteria. They usually live in hospitals, and you can actually get sicker from the bacteria than you would have when you went into the hospital. So you've got to be careful about it, and that's why we're always looking for better and stronger antibiotics. But every time we bring in a new antibiotic, it's just a matter of time before bacteria evolve to be resistant to it. Now, bacteria aren't the only things that are resistant. The same can occur in sexually reproducing animals. Some bugs have become resistant to pesticides, and some rabbits are becoming immune to human-created diseases. These animals are more likely to reproduce and more resistant population. These animals are more likely to reproduce and more resistant population, creating a more resistant population. This, by the way, ladies and gents, this is kind of like artificial selection, but bad. So what happens is someone wants me to go back real quick. Let me just go back to the last slide really quick. Someone's almost finished writing it down. So I'm going to put this up for about another 10 seconds. Okay, so finishing off this last slide here, let's do this here. So, oopsies, why can't I change the slide? Here we go. Some bugs are becoming resistant to pesticides. So here we've got a pesticide spray. These animals are more likely to reproduce, creating a more resistant population. This is kind of like artificial selection, but bad, in that we're selecting animals to survive, but we're not really selecting animals. We don't want any of the animals to survive, but we accidentally make it so that we're selecting the animals that are the best at avoiding our treatment. So let's say I've got these bugs, and I've got this bug spray. So I spray the bugs with the bug spray. You know, all the bugs die. Well, most of them die. This one on the bottom left, it doesn't die. That's okay, doesn't matter. And then that bug instead has more baby bugs. And so you're like, okay, well, let's now spray them. And so you spray them with the spray, but they don't die because they are resistant to, they are now a resistant population. And yes, this is happening in, like, this does happen. We used to use, with crops, with like corn and like, you know, whatever, beans, we spray them with pesticides to kill all the bugs so that, you know, when we take those plants to the supermarket, you guys don't get half-eaten lettuces by bugs. But bugs over time, of course, sexually reproduce. The ones that survive to reproduce are the ones that are resistant to the spray. So therefore, you end up with bug resistance, spray resistant bugs. Right? Yeah, spray resistant bugs, and not bug resistant spray. Or bug resistant spray. I don't know. The other one of those two. But essentially, what those new bugs are they are immune. And ladies and gents, I'm going to keep this up for another 30 seconds. Let's use our words again just to quickly. Well, I've got 30 seconds while people are finishing this off. Let's use our words. So the variation here, so, well, let's go with the selective pressure. What was the selective pressure? The selective pressure in this case was the, you know, the bug spray. And what was the competition? The competition was to survive. To survive the poison. What was the variation? Well, the variation was, of course, you know, somewhere maybe they had, I don't know, they were just these, but I didn't say what the variation was, but the variation could have just been, I don't know, different chemicals. Maybe different filters in nose or something like that. I don't know. And so therefore that causes them to not be killed. You might have other ones. So you might have a different filter in your smaller lungs so you don't inhale as much. You might be able to smell the bug spray before you inhale it so you can run away so you don't die from the bug spray, something like that. But these are all variations. And that variation and different filter in the nose causes these bugs to survive and other bugs to die. But that's how you can refer to these three ideas here. So ladies and gents, that's actually it for this lesson.